Hello. You guys can hear me? All right, great. This is the first of two YouTube videos today. I'm really stressing about college right now, but you know what? I have this platform, so it's a lot of fun. We're going to be talking about, the eighth episode of the Dahmer Netflix series. We have two more to go, and I already feel like I've gotten enough out of it. I mean, my goodness, we've gotten a lot out of the show. I praise the creators, I praise the writers, and in that process, you guys should realize I'm not at all praising the action of Jeffrey Dahmer. Obviously, it's a blessing in the psychological world for something like this to happen, for them to do further research, but obviously it's not anything we wish on our worst enemies, of the victims. What happened to the victims, I wouldn't wish on anybody. In this episode, they play the blame game. That's kind of like the central, theme of the episode. Who is to blame for Jeffrey Dahmer? That's the big focal point that they get into in this episode. The simplest explanation, the one ultimately prioritized by his victims' families, the court, and even Jeffrey himself, is that the real culprit is Jeffrey Dahmer. The general consensus is if you're a serial killer and you're out killing people, it's probably your fault, especially if you're not legally insane. For Jeff, this is a matter of accepting responsibility for his crimes, the heinousness of which he recognizes. Death is the only reprieve he seeks. It's kind of sad. For the families in the court, it's a matter of not allowing Dahmer to escape punishment, at least in the sense of a life sentence in prison, but pleading insanity. That was kind of the plan for Jeff, his lawyer, and his father. They came together. They're like, look, we can get you in a hospital. We can get you some psychiatric help. We can just pledge insanity. And, obviously some psychological or some psychologists probably got together, studied some of his patterns. They gave him all the stuff they needed. And they realized this guy is not insane. He's just a fucking sick human being that came from a pretty dislodged family. Let's be honest. Jeff says he's not insane, though. He tells these people, I'm not insane. I'm not going to lie about this. This episode is named after his father, Lionel. You guys should know that. This episode was written by Ian Brenner, David McMillan, directed by Greg Araki. He suggests this legal tactic of pledging sanity. Lionel does. Lionel continues reminding Jeff that he said that sometimes he couldn't remember what he'd done. When that happens, when you're not conscious, when you're not aware of what you're doing, when everything becomes a blur, you're pretty much insane and you have something wrong with you, right? Mentally. Jeff makes the excuse. He was blacked out drunk. That's why he was. That's why he didn't remember some stuff. But he knew what he was doing. He didn't want to do it. He couldn't help himself. He's not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew exactly what his intentions were. He wasn't insane. His father wants to get him out of this situation. And I don't know why his father took this route. I understand it's his fault. He thinks it's his fault anyway. That he did this to his son. But you can't get him out of a situation like this when he is not insane. Like, they proved he was not insane. Of course, sitting there, we can plainly see this is just a silly game of semantics, like just trying to get him out of the system. Jeffrey Dahmer drilled holes in people's skulls to try to create zombies. He collected human remains from the people he killed. He murdered and ate people, having sex with their corpse in the interim. This doesn't meet the legal standard of insanity only because that standard is ridiculous, because our justice system is barbaric. Like, the things you have to do to and prove that you're insane is insane, actually. We have a very strict judicial system. That's not going to fly, even back in the 80s, in the 90s, actually. You don't have to have sympathy for the guy to recognize any of this stuff, nor would recognizing it lessen Dahmer's responsibility. As we've seen, he made choice after choice to further his campaign of murder. He chose to do this. He didn't. The first two were on accident, and then he chose to do this. He did this with ill intent, evil intent, not because it was personal, but because he just felt like doing it. It was an impulse, or somehow mitigate the cruelty and injustice of what he did, or make his victims' families' desire for him to spend the rest of his life behind bars somehow less reasonable or understandable. It just is what it is. as an side note, it's always grimly funny to kind of see stories in which the likes of the Joker or Hannibal Lecter are found not guilty by reason of mental disease or a defect. The latter would have been found guilty like Dahmer, and the former would have been shot to death in the street the moment he first pulled a gun on a cop. But let's move on. For Lionel, though, clinging to the belief that his son was insane when he committed his crimes is important because, for a long while at least, he lives in terror of the idea that he was in some way responsible for it all himself. Again, that's why they named the episode Lionel, because this is about how Lionel dealt with it mainly. You have Joyce thrown in there, you have Sherry kind of helping him out, but this episode, Lionel was the main character for the first time in the entire... last episode it was Glenda Cleveland. This episode, Lionel. These are the two main characters of these last two episodes, and I like that. I like how this show puts into perspective what Lionel was going through, what Glenda was going through, because my goodness, if you think Lionel was going through a lot in this episode, call back to Glenda's episode. My goodness. She's living next door to saws whirring, people screaming in agony. Oh my goodness. And the fact she heard those things, it's wow. It's a lot to take in. When Jeff brings up the way Lionel used to help him collect and dissect roadkill, Lionel literally starts laughing in comical outrage over the idea. When really, that's kind of a reasonable point to bring up on Jeffrey's part. You took your son to collect roadkill because that's the only way you could ever bond with this kid, You were out at work, you were working days and nights, and the only thing you could do is on a weekend take your son out to the road and say, oh my goodness, look, a dead animal, let's dissect it and look at its organs and shit. And, when he first comes into with the police and they tell him about his son's crime, I can't believe he wasn't thinking about this. Your son is drilling holes in people's heads, just like you said with the frogs. He's taking their hearts out, just like you did with dissecting animals and you taught him. And yet you never saw this. You never saw the parallels. Obviously, he didn't know of these parallels until... they told him, or he didn't know these parallels were even possible until the police told him about the crimes. But man, the second you hear that, you kind of have to take responsibility. I'm gonna be honest. He's like, you're not gonna lay this on me. He tells Jeff that. It's not his fault. He didn't do this. He was a good dad to you. Of course he wants to believe this. Who wouldn't in his position? You wouldn't want to take blame for a damn murder. No one would, especially if you didn't actually do it. And obviously, I don't think, as far as I'm concerned, Lionel Dahmer got any charges or anything in terms of child neglect, child endangerment, nothing like that. Because, obviously it was indirectly related, dissecting animals to dissecting humans is obviously different and it has different penalties. Obviously they couldn't give him, if he was helping his son dissect humans, if he was a medical major and he was giving his son human corpses and having him dissect them, yes, you could blame him, or you could charge him, but I still think you can blame him. Over the course of the episode, we watch his resolve against accepting responsibility break down. He's keen to blame anyone he can. His ex-wife Joyce for taking so many pills during her pregnancy, or comic books about Dahmer's cultural antecedent. Grave robbing killer Ed Gein. Lionel railing at the culture for creating Jeffrey is not unlike what a lot of critics of the show are saying. Or for abandoning Jeff during a pivotal post-high school summer, him just being left at his house. Wow. Sherry, although she didn't mean it, and she didn't mean it to come out this way, she asked him where he was that summer, to his face. She tried to be supportive. Uncharacteristically cutting remarks she immediately apologizes for because she realizes the second she says that, my goodness, I just ruined this man off of that. But the point seems to clear the fog surrounding Lionel. He suddenly remembers his own violent childhood urges, building makeshift bombs, trying to hypnotize a girl he had a crush on, fantasizing about murder during church, having nightmares that he'd kill someone and didn't know what to do afterwards. He comes to believe he passed this part of himself down to Jeffrey, and it's about the genes. He says this to Jeff after the conviction before he's hauled off to prison, but ultimately... he gets at where he really was responsible, not by somehow genetically passing down his most macabre fantasies, but through neglect. He says he wasn't a good father. Choking back tears as he does so often during this episode. This was a really emotional roller coaster for him. great acting by Richard Jenkins. He created a sympathetic portrait of a man who's made it hard to be as sympathetic. He wasn't, because he wasn't a good husband, and Jeff didn't feel safe. He can't believe that he left Jeff alone. That's kind of what he was saying. It's a lot to have on your conscience, but Lionel was not alone in being a family member living with misery and regret. His ex Joyce tries to kill herself, and this shows that she cares. Like, she cares about this. She was taking pills. She didn't necessarily care about Jeff as a child, but she cares. Like, she killed herself over this. She tried to kill herself over this. The uncharitable read is that this is an attempt to re-center the attention on her own plight. So I guess that is kind of selfishness, but that's a good way to interpret it, I guess. And one by one, members of the victims' families read their statements in the courtroom. This was a really iconic moment in the Dahmer case. One reads a poem, another concludes by saying, "God bless America." The Lau family we've met before, who had 2 sons fall victim to Jeffrey in different ways, testified that this has shattered their immigrant belief in the American dream. Now, I'm not sure if these were taken off the actual impact statements of the actual victims. Probably paraphrased it, though. And one woman screams obscenities at Jeffrey, demanding that he look at her, demanding that he bear witness to her anger and pain, things Jeff can only really understand in the abstract, the same way he understands life itself. There's something I never really picked up before on this episode, but there are hints of Napoleon Dynamite and Dr. Steve Brule in the quiet, slightly mush-mouthed way that Evan Peters talks as Dahmer. It's as if he's taking the lovable loser toolkit and weaponizing it like Dahmer did with actual toolkits. That's an interesting... I'm reading off a Decider, by the way. Of course, there's one group that accepts no responsibility for what happened. The cops. They kind of mentioned that a little bit. The 2 officers suspended for returning Dahmer's victims to are reinstated to raucous applause. The chief who suspended them can only stand there and glare. He's like, I cannot believe this. This is gonna fly, and we're gonna get heat for the rest of our existence as a police force. They warned him they'd be around long after he was gone, and they were right. Jeff said, "Guess you really did it this time, huh?" And he says to his dad. They reunite immediately following his arrest, and they sentence him and stuff. And then he has this moment with his dad. Yes, he did, to a lot of people, in a lot of different ways that will reverberate up and down society for a long time to come, ways that have ended lives and will ruin others forever. So, yeah, that's the episode. I don't have much to say. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Hopefully you enjoyed my review here. I try to go as in-depth in the episode as possible. It's a really interesting show. I can't wait to watch the last 2 episodes. I should be doing that tomorrow and Friday. School's kicking my ass, so we're going to have to see.